everybody. I'm Teresa Miller. I'm the CIO from Lionsgate Entertainment, and I'm currently the committee chair for Innovate at UCLA's Women in Technology Committee. We welcome you today to our fourth virtual event in our series this year. This will be the final program for the WIT committee this year in 2022. And for those of you that don't know, Innovate at UCLA is a professional organization that is aligned with UCLA. We do these types of events, both virtual and in person. We have opportunities to work with the students and lots of networking and professional opportunities. It is a membership-based organization, and we'll talk more about that at the end of today's session. But today we are very excited to have Kim Jones here to help us create our path to the C-suite. Kim is an executive leadership and career coach. She's also a speaker, a facilitator, and has a master's in anthropology, which she leverages as a gender equality advisor. She has a vast background of experience. She was, before getting into this arena, she was a CIO for Farmers Insurance, leading teams of over 1,000 people. And so she has lots of hands-on practical experience to share with us today. So I'd like to welcome Kim to WIT and Innovate at UCLA.
Thank you so much, Teresa, for that introduction. I'm so excited to be with all of you this afternoon to talk about a couple of my favorite topics. So I am going to talk about my own journey to the C-suite, but I'm going to be tying it very heavily to leading in the new normal, because the way that I navigated my path from my early days in corporate life to the C-suite, I would likely do things very differently now, given how the workplace has evolved, especially in light of COVID, but just in relation to us being part of the 21st century, where we are subjected to a lot of things that are emerging and evolving that really wasn't a part of the workforce when I made my start in corporate America in the early 90s. I am going to go ahead and share my slides, and we're going to jump right in. All right. So there's really two key things that I'm going to be focusing on today. Let me just get to my controls here. All right. We're going to talk about leading in the new normal and also managing up. This was a topic that Teresa thought might be of particular relevance to so many of you, and it is such an important skill to have in leadership so that you can maximize your influence and really make the impact that you're looking for in the jobs that you have. So we're going to really focus on leading in the new normal, but then I'm going to share with you some things that I did effectively in my career to manage up effectively. All right. So when I mention leading in the new normal, a lot of you might be wondering what exactly I mean by that. There's a lot of things that go into the environment that we find ourselves in now that we could classify as the new normal. But what I am particularly speaking about when I reference the new normal is two very significant things that are happening in the current work environments that we find ourselves in. The first of those is an uncharacteristically high level of disruption that we're all having to learn how to adapt to and manage, coupled with high levels of employee disengagement. Now, disengagement is not anything that's new. We saw disengagement levels that were very high even before COVID hit, but what we're seeing now are some new behaviors in response to that disengagement that become important for us to think about as leaders. I'm going to start with this graphic, which was presented earlier this year at a Gartner seminar that I went to that I thought was particularly eye-opening and capturing exactly what we're talking about when we talk about these highly disruptive environments that we find ourselves in. So what this slide is depicting is how disruptions have trended up significantly over the last few years. Looking at 2014 as a baseline year, and so let me define what I mean by disruptions first. Disruptions are any events that impact the operations of a business. They can be coming from outside the company, they can be internally generated events, but they affect the day-to-day operations. So if we look at 2014 as a baseline year for that, so disruptions being things like political events, social unrest, for example, the overturning of Roe versus Wade and how that's impacting employees, or the George Floyd murders, which impacts how people think about their place and inclusion in the workplace. Those would be included. They could be things like mergers and acquisitions, leadership changes, wars like in Ukraine. If for those of you who had operations in Europe would know that would have been very disruptive to the work environment. So all of those things count towards disruptions. And if we look at 2014 as being sort of a baseline year for a number of disruptions, and we trend that into the current era, about 8 years into it, what we're seeing is, even before we look at COVID, we're at about 4 times, looking at 2022, about 4 times the level of disruptions that we had back in 2014. And if you add COVID to that, you see that dashed line above. In 2020, we would have been about 6 times the level of disruption as 2014, and we're trending back up there in the next few years. So I think this gives a really good example of the types of ways that we need to show up in the workplace as we find ourselves in these environments that are disrupting our operations, and then also disrupting how our employees are experiencing work, as well as things that might be happening in their home life that is carrying into work through some of these broader events and pandemics. All right, so the other topic I want to cover as part of the new normal is employee disengagement. This slide actually shows the trending of quit lines. These are the number of people that voluntarily quit their jobs on a year-over-year basis. And I think what you'll note is that you can see kind of the ties and the ups and downs that fluctuate with what's happening in the broader social space. So around the time of the Great Recession a few years ago, back in 2008, 2009, we saw quit rates really go down. But what we're seeing now, and we sort of trended average over the last few years, is in 2021, the quit rates went up significantly. And it's not necessarily because employees are less engaged than they were before COVID, although that certainly could be a factor. But it's the fact that employees are willing to take action as a result of the things that they may have been tolerating all along, but previously were willing to put up with things. So for example, if they were overworked, if they were underpaid, if they didn't have a good career path or career progression, if they were in a toxic environment or had a boss that didn't respect them or was aggressive in how they treated you. All of those things were sort of accepted as common workplace behavior, have been accepted as common workplace behavior. Now we see employees really reevaluating the meaning of work in this post-COVID environment and what they're willing to sacrifice personally for their employment. And so that's really driving these quit rates, which if we think about in this talent scarce market that we're in, it becomes an added burden for leaders to respond to these trends in ways that they can keep their operations running smoothly. So these two things, disruption and disengagement, have significantly changed how we should be thinking about showing up in the workplace. So what we're going to cover today, we're going to start with my leadership journey and what's changed in the years since I made my own way to the C-suite. I'm going to talk about tips for leading in the new normal. So as we think about disruption and disengagement, how is it that we can think about leading in ways where we're not only retaining our employees and getting the work done, but where we're inspiring employees and creating high levels of engagement that allow our teams to thrive. And then finally, we're going to spend a little bit of time on how to effectively manage up, again, so you can maximize your impact at work. All right, my leadership journey looks like 25 years from administrative assistant to divisional CIO for Farmers Insurance Group. As Teresa mentioned, I was head of the personal lines IT organization for Farmers Insurance, in charge of everything from day-to-day run and maintain operations to major legacy systems transformations. And there was a lot that I navigated along my path, and we could go into so much information here, but if I had to say what was the key strategy that allowed me to progress is I was adapting very consciously to the leadership, the prevailing leadership norms while I was executing change within it. So I had a brand and a reputation for being a leader, a change leader. All of my jobs over my 25-year career had some component of taking something and transforming it into something else, whether it was in IT or previously in business operations. And the way that I did that was I sort of fit into the existing system and then figured out how to execute change within that in ways where people were feeling bought in and committed and inspired to what we were doing to the best that we could. Here's what it actually looked like when I started my career. The leadership teams that I was exposed to looked a lot like the picture in the upper left-hand corner, primarily white, male. This may not look completely different from a lot of companies today, but we're really trying to move out of this model that was built really in the 20th century and probably even before that to really serve who was in the workplace at the time, which were predominantly white men. And so as women and other underrepresented groups started entering corporate America, the way that we successfully did that, and now we're talking about the late 20th century, is by adapting. Many of us, not everybody, many of us adapted to the ways that leadership was viewed as being successful. So if we think about what that means, it was very hierarchically based. It was very much centered on commanding and controlling the resources, the output, the people, the tools. So my job as a leader in that era was to really make sure that the operations were getting done. And it wasn't really too closely looked at how we were getting it done. Because again, remember, people may have felt disengaged, but we weren't so focused on that at that time. We were focused more on how we were getting the work done. So what this looked like for me personally is I acted and behaved and operated like the model of leaders ahead of me. So saying it another way, I felt like one of the guys, honestly. When I came to work, I behaved like them, I led like them, I communicated like them, I hung out with them, which was a great strategy at the time for getting ahead. But in looking back, it's not how I would do it today. For one thing, it's not very inclusive, right? It doesn't account for the fact that many people don't want to have to come in and conform to a mold that doesn't align with who they are authentically as leaders. And it doesn't actually do what we're trying to do now, which is break the mold that there's one single way to leadership and be more inclusive of who we have in leadership, their experiences, their perspectives, and also shifting away from this idea that leading is all about technical skills and control of resources and managing performance. And now it's much more about the kinds of things that we need to build that engagement to really stem the tide of change that's happening that's very disruptive in organizations because of lack of employee engagement and the chaos that we see really in our society and in some of our workplaces. So what I want to do here is just tie the point that what we really want to do is think about moving ourselves out of this model of the upper left and down into the model of the lower right. Because many of us, I suspect even today, have been brought through leadership by people like me and like the people in this picture who grew up in these older 20th century models and maybe adapting these behaviors. So that's really where we stand now in terms of at least how I'm thinking about leadership. All right, so just to bring it home, our focus today really needs to be moving away from these old models and more on the soft skills. And it's so fascinating to me that we're talking so much about this now. As a cultural and social anthropologist and someone who's been very invested in understanding leadership for many years, it's amazing to me how these concepts have been around for some time. The idea that we want to inspire, include, have empathy, lead with people's well-being in mind, all of those are not new concepts. But what we're seeing now is that there's a burning platform for us to implement them because of what we're seeing. The sense of urgency is greater and people are actually thinking that they need to invest in their leaders. Companies are doing this to make sure that they're evolving their skills in ways that allow for the results that, to kind of turn the results that we're experiencing right now. Relearning is really important to this, again, because we've all been brought up to some degree or another under outdated models. There's a quote by Alvin Toffler that I love. Some of you may have heard it. The illiterate of the future are not those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So the fact is that as things continue to evolve, we need to be continuously looking at the things that we've learned about leadership and how we personally are leading, and constantly reinvent and modify those approaches so that they adapt to the environments that we find ourselves in. All right, so why is this all so important? Obviously, we want to keep good people from leaving, and we want to be adaptable in disruptive and changing times. But one of the things that I love, this is actually a white paper that Bain Consulting did a few years ago, where they talked about the importance of creating inspired employees. And they used an analogy of Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the workplace. So for those of you who don't exactly remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, let me just give you a quick overview. At the very foundation of our needs as human beings, we have our needs for safety and security. So this is basically food, shelter, and clothing. So those are our basic needs that, if not met, we will spend our time in this level of the pyramid getting those needs met. When those needs are met, we want to move up to the next level, which is the belonging level. This is where we create a sense of community, where we connect with our quote unquote tribe. It's where we develop meaningful relationships with others. And then finally, if we get that part right, and it's not linear, but assuming it's a progression, you move up to the next level, which is self-actualization, which is where we connect with something greater than ourselves, where we have meaning in our lives, where we feel like we have a sense of purpose. If we bring the same concept into the workplace and look at the bottom pyramid of satisfied employees. So for an employee to be satisfied, they need to be getting their basic needs met at work. So they feel safe in their work environment, they have the resources they need to do their job, they are fairly rewarded and compensated and valued for the work that they do, and they're able to work without excess bureaucracy. So you get all that right and you get a satisfied employee. That's wonderful. But what we know is many companies are actually striving to build engaged employees, because the results are there that engaged employees have real benefits to the performance of an organization. So engaged employees differ from satisfied employees because, again, that sense of belonging is brought into the workplace. Now they're feeling like they're able to do their job autonomously, they're bringing value, they're learning and growing, but importantly, they feel like they're part of an extraordinary team. So this has really been the holy grail for a long time for many companies. But it turns out, according to Bain, that there's a level even higher, which is creating inspired employees, where employees really get meaning and inspiration through connecting to the mission of the company. They believe that they're part of something greater than themselves. And this is really inspired by leadership. So having leaders that are helping employees feel that connection and that meaning from their work through things like social responsibility, or just making them feel like their work is absolutely critical to the mission of the company. These are the companies that are moving up this pyramid and creating inspired employees. And why is this important? Well, let's look at what it means to have an inspired employee base in relationship to satisfied employees as a function of productive output. So let's say, again, we have those satisfied employees. These are employees that are getting their basic work needs met, and their output is 100%. They're doing their jobs and they're doing them well, and we're getting from them what we hired them to do. On either side of it, if you have a dissatisfied employee, which unfortunately more than 50% of employees, even before COVID, were saying that they were disengaged from their work, their output is about 71% that of a satisfied employee. On the other hand, if you create that connection, that sense of belonging, and you get an engaged employee, your output increases by 44% over a satisfied employee. And that's why so many companies strive for this. But what's amazing to know is that if you create that inspired employee who's getting deeper meaning from their work, they are more than 2 times as productive as a satisfied employee. And the bonus is that they are more likely to be retained and loyal to the organization, which means that you spend less of your time as a manager on all the things that go with managing turnover. So that's really what we're talking about, leading in the new normal. So before, people kind of stayed put. They didn't move around quite so much as they do now. We were probably living with, less than 100% productive output because they were disengaged. But now, because of the level of disruption and the amount of employee turnover that companies are experiencing because of the factors that employees are now no longer to live with, it becomes really, really important to think about how we create those engaged employees so we keep them, and then we have this bonus of having much better productive output. All right, so let's talk about some tips for how to do this. So I'm going to talk about how we can think about leading in the new normal. And many of these concepts will be familiar to you. I don't think I'm going to be sharing anything earth-shattering or groundbreaking, but I'm going to really bring it home as to why this is so important for us to think about developing as leaders. Many companies, so in my practice as a coach, many companies are really investing in developing their leaders in these ways. And so if you can think about doing this for yourself, you will create a competitive advantage for you as you think about moving up in leadership. So there's a lot of benefit in thinking about these things now. Okay, going back to the Gartner study that I referenced earlier, the seminar that I attended at the beginning of the year, they actually talked about the new manager mandate that is redefining the future of how managers need to be showing up at work. They talked about how we're moving away from this criteria of having technical skills and a solid track record of work performance to really looking for people who are strong in the following four characteristics: empathy, coaching, flexibility, and well-being. Note that this says nothing about technical skills. It says nothing about managing performance. It says nothing about controlling resources. Those are all things that still remain part of our jobs, but this is what the manager of the 21st century is expected to look like to create those inspired employees. So I'm going to talk about how you can create an environment for developing inspired employees, and it all starts with you. That first component here of the three components is emotional intelligence, which is really how you show up as a leader. It's how you create empathy. It's how you connect to your employees. It's how you care about their well-being, which is so important for people now. If you look at how employees are looking at their employers, they're no longer just looking for well-being from a financial standpoint. They expect their employers to provide them with emotional well-being, with mental health benefits, with physical well-being, with work-life balance. So really having empathy and emotional intelligence, we'll talk a little bit more about this, is super important for building the foundation for how you lead in the 21st century. The next thing we're going to talk about is the really important concept of psychological safety, which is critical for building the trust that teams need with their companies and their teams. If we look at why so many people were leaving their jobs, they had lost trust in their companies during COVID. They saw how their companies were reacting, how they were laying people off, the responses they had to issues with childcare and with working from home, things like that. And it really eroded the trust. So building that trust back, psychological safety is absolutely critical for that. And then finally, we're going to talk about positive leadership, which is so important for building the confidence that we need in these environments that are so chaotic. And you as a leader set the tone and the pace for positive leadership. So we're going to talk about each of these a little bit in turn, starting with emotional intelligence. So for those of you who don't know what emotional intelligence is, it's really how you manage and use your emotions to be effective in the workplace. And it literally comprises more than 50% of your job success. So people who are able to understand emotions and respond appropriately from them in a very self-regulated way significantly outperform those who do not. Emotional intelligence actually has four components to it. The first two have to do with how you are aware and regulate self. So let's say we're in a chaotic environment, we're leading in a chaotic environment, and we get word that one of our top people has quit their job. Emotional intelligence comes into play because many people would react to that in a way that's very obvious to the people that they're surrounded by. So they may react from a place of frustration, or they may react from a place of fear, and they might start interacting and relating to people from those emotions. And that can really erode the kinds of environments that people feel safe in, that they feel connected to. The second piece of this is the social awareness, which has two components to it. It's managing, reading the environment and managing your relationships. And this is so important because this is really where empathy comes from. It's amazing when, I've been doing career coaching for a number of years now. And a few years ago, I didn't used to see job descriptions asking for empathy as one of the core skills. And now it's pretty much making its way into most, at least, senior leadership roles. So having empathy, really understanding what your employees are going through, what they expect from the workplace, being flexible to meet their needs rather than having the one-size-fits-all approaches that we've used in the past, is really super important for leading in the new normal. Okay, so Pablo, if you wouldn't mind, if you could please drop the workbook in the chat. I've got a workbook, a handout that gives you some resources to use to really help you apply what we're talking about today to your job after this session. So the first thing that I'm going to call out is, if you're interested in building your emotional intelligence, and that is the great news about emotional intelligence, it is a skill that you can learn. A great place to get started if you're interested in that is to read the book Emotional Intelligence and take the emotional intelligence quiz. The actual results will call out where you are lowest and where you have opportunities for improvement, and there are strategies in the book that you can use to start bringing your scores up. All right, moving on to the next critical component to leading in the new normal is building psychological safety. When I started teaching on this concept several years ago, almost nobody had heard of psychological safety. Now many people have, and I suspect many of you in this room have heard of psychological safety. For those of you who have not, I'm going to introduce this concept to you through the Project Aristotle, which was an initiative that Google launched back in 2012 when they were involved in all kinds of social science research and were particularly interested in understanding what differentiated high-performing teams from those teams that did not perform so well. They looked at 180 teams. They studied all kinds of variables, everything you can think of, the types of skills that were on the team, the ways that the teams were compensated, the resources that they were given, the sponsorship that happened at the executive level, how the mix of skills across the different team members. And they looked for patterns, and they could not find a single pattern that differentiated high-performing teams from other teams except for one. And that concept is psychological safety. Psychological safety has actually been around as a concept since 1999, when Harvard researcher Amy Edmondson discovered this in her research about what differentiated high-performing teams from others. And at the time, Google found this study that Edmondson had done, and they started to talk about this really important concept. Well, here we are 10 years later, and it's just making its way into the common day-to-day vernacular of important aspects of building high-performing and sustainable teams. So what is psychological safety? Psychological safety is basically summed up in the sentiment and the feeling that you would have if you believe that my team has my back. So if we think about what this means and how we would show up at work if we felt like our team had our backs, we would show up authentically as who we are. We would use our voice and experiences to speak up about things. We would talk about ideas without the fear of looking stupid. We would not be afraid to make mistakes and have the finger point at us. So it's this sense that I am valued on my team fully as who I am, and that my contributions are important to the team. And once you build this in a team, this allows the team to work collaboratively together in a way that gets results that you don't see if this aspect is missing. So this is a really important concept of leading in the new normal. And I would argue that emotional intelligence of the leader and the teams are really important in this as well, so that as things are going wrong and so forth, we're regulating ourselves and working productively through issues as they come up. This does require courage and vulnerability for people to show up as themselves. They have to take risks, and we all know risk taking is where innovation happens and where teams are able to go above and beyond the expected outcomes. So again, if you look in your handout, I've got a bunch of resources in here that you can reference. So the first is a 5-minute psychological safety audit, where you can actually assess just how well your organization, your team, your environment is with respect to psychological safety. You can, there's an example illustrative creed that you can use for establishing parameters for psychological safety on your team. And then finally, there are ways for you to selectively model vulnerable leadership, so people start to feel safe doing the same for themselves. So things like talking about the mistakes you've made and how they were learning and growth opportunities would be examples of things that you could do. Asking your team for help and feedback would be other examples. So check out the resources. You'll get some ideas there if this is something you're interested in developing. Okay, and last but not least, positive leadership. So there's actually a really exciting branch of academia right now that's interested in what they're called, what the academics are calling positive organizational scholarship, POS. And what this is interested in is understanding how employee potential is maximized in the workplace through creating well-being. And so there's all kinds of research and data being compiled on what this looks like. And there's a few things that are important here as we think about building the kinds of environments that will allow employees to thrive. The first is having a growth mindset. Growth mindset is such an important topic, and we obviously don't have a lot of time to go into today, so I highly recommend you check it out if you're not familiar with it. But it's a concept developed by researcher Carol Dweck, which found that people tend to fall into a category of having a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. And what differentiates the two is how we tend to look at talent development. So for those of us who believe that talent can be developed, that our skills and talents are not fixed, have a growth mindset. So these are the leaders that are encouraging their employees to continue to develop and to do more and to grow, and that they're capable of achieving more. Whereas those with a fixed mindset tend to look at talent as fixed. And so if you have an employee, for example, who's not performing well or is having an issue in a certain area, you tend to come at it more from the perspective that this is just how the employee is, there's nothing we can do about it. Bringing that growth mindset helps people really feel inspired to continue growing, improving, and learning, which is so important for 21st century workplaces that are under high levels of flux, and things change at a very rapid rate. The next important concept is to lead from your strengths. We are so conditioned in the business world to compensate for our weaknesses and figure out how we can do better with the things that we're not strong at. So for example, if I'm not a great natural communicator, I might be hearing from my boss about how I need to communicate better. And what that tends to do is it erodes confidence, it erodes trust, versus if you can think about where the employee really excels and really build their strengths, in addition to using their strengths to help them shore up their weaknesses. So perhaps if they're not a great communicator, but they're really solid in data analytics, for example, perhaps there's a way for them to use their skills in analysis to help them improve the way that they show up and speak. So this is an example of strengths-based leadership. It's really great also for you to think about how you're going to develop your own leadership brand from a strengths-based perspective, rather than trying to be somebody that you're not, which many of us can fall into in leadership. And in the handout, in the resource handout, if you don't know your Clifton Strengths profile, I highly recommend you take the assessment and really get to understand and know your strengths as well as the strengths on your team, so that you can cultivate them in your leadership role. And finally, positive leadership is grounded in positive and optimistic communications. So with all of the changes that we're experiencing, people hearing positive messages in terms of how the company will respond, or you're responding, or the team is responding. Not sugarcoating or overlaying information that is difficult, but really helping the team see ahead to how options for responding, so that you build resilience and you build that sense of we're all in this together and we can get through it together. All right, so that's basically some tips that I have for how to think about building the environment and your own leadership skills in ways that really meet that new manager mandate that Gartner talked about. So again, notice I didn't spend a lot of time on your technical skills or any of that, because really we need to start thinking about this differently. Those other things, technical skills, all of that is still table stakes, but we need to be doing more as leaders given what the new normal looks like. All right, so we are quickly running out of time, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So I'm just going to spend a quick minute talking about how to manage up effectively. And this is something that I would say I learned to do over the course of my career, and it paid dividends. So managing up is really, a lot of people tend to think about it as it relates to a one-off conversation with a manager, or a one-off situation where I've got some issue and I want to figure out how to manage up. But if we take a step back, managing up is really done most effectively when we create a foundation for being able to effectively influence and use persuasive skills to manage up in ways that help promote us as thought leaders and experts in our area. So there's 3 components. I'm really only going to talk about one of them. The first is to build your mindset as a subject matter expert, meaning that you understand the value you bring to the organization, and especially in the area where you're strong. So my particular area of subject matter expertise was in leading and managing change. And so I learned to develop the mindset that my opinions and my beliefs and my input was really valuable in this area, regardless of who I was speaking with in the organization, that they had me there for that specific reason. So this really requires you to challenge your relationship with authority, to challenge what you think the rules are around managing up, and to see that it's your job as a leader to really come forward as the expert in the area that you're in and challenge as appropriate and bring your input as appropriate. The next is to build your influence as a thought partner. One of the things that I found to be really critical in managing up was to build relationships with the people that I worked for and who were above me in terms of position on the org chart. And that really helped to create sort of a credibility around who I was, but also it allowed me to be a thought partner to them. So I would often offer to be at the table helping, with strategy or lending my expertise on something that could help them with a goal that they had. So I didn't just view myself as the person that was there to do the job that I was hired to do, but I was also there to lend my support and influence and input in those conversations with higher ups where it was appropriate to do so. And establishing that thought partnership really is great for managing up. And then last but not least, and we're going to spend just a minute on this because I think this is the most tactical thing that, that we can walk away from today, is to build your approach in managing up as a negotiator. So if you think about going into some of these conversations when you're managing up, what you're usually trying to do is to get something. You're either trying to, bring information in that's important for decision making, or you need something as an employee that you're not getting. And so really thinking about that as a negotiation is a great way to have those conversations. So if we look at the steps and by the way, there's lots more in your resource guide on this because we obviously don't have a ton of time to go into this, but there are really 4 key steps. The first is for you to define your desired outcome. So we hear this all the time. Don't just come with a problem, come with a solution. But now we're not just talking about a solution, we're talking about what it is that you really want. So let's talk about a specific scenario. Let's say that you want to have more one-on-one time with your boss. Your boss tends to not show up for your one-on-one meetings. They get canceled all the time. And as a result, you don't have a lot of time to have interaction and to set the course for work that you're doing, et cetera. So your desired outcome, you might start at the surface and say, well, I want more one-on-one time. But here I'd recommend you go deeper. Why is having more one-on-one time important? So if you start to tie it to, I can be a more effective employee if I have more one-on-one time with you, because I'll be able to get your input on things that will help us make the right decisions. And, we're going to manage risks better, et cetera. So really define what you're looking to get out of it, not just from a personal perspective, but how it will benefit the organization. The next thing is to understand the other side's position, typical negotiation stuff, right? So this would be where you would say, well, my boss is really busy and she obviously doesn't think my issue is at the top of her priority list. So she's skipping out on our meetings because she's not seeing the level of value commensurate with other things that are on her plate. So if you understand that about her, then maybe the thing you want to think about is, how can I bring in value into those discussions? So again, this is where thought partnership and your subject matter expertise, rather than just an update, could be super helpful. But really then preparing your points with their goal in mind. So let's say that your boss is really working on becoming a more inclusive leader. And that happens to be an area that you are particularly strong in. You could say to your boss, like, hey, I really think that if we spent more time together, I could give you some more insights on how you might think about your goal for inclusion. Or because, I am in an underrepresented group, hearing my experiences and my perspectives might really be valuable for you. So again, here we're tying your goal to something that's important to the person that you're looking to influence. And then finally, you're going to have the conversation and you're going to figure out where there's common ground. So maybe your boss can't meet with you every week, but she can meet with you every other week. Or maybe she can call you on the drive in to work and you can do it that way. Or perhaps you can think of some other way where you both get what you need, and that common ground is the place where agreements are made and it becomes a win-win. So that is sort of my thinking on how to manage up at a very high level. Again, there's more information on how you can prep for these conversations in the handout that you have. All right, so that is the end of the presentation portion of this. I would love to open it up now for questions, and also for all of you to reflect on these three questions. What's your biggest takeaway? What will you be doing differently going forward? And what's one thing you can start to do immediately?
Great. So we do have a few questions in the chat. Let me jump in and read some of these. And if I don't get it right, please jump in and clarify. So we have from Edward Yen. What are some tips to convince the top executive to embrace leading in the new normal?
Yeah, so the place that I would start immediately is, what is it costing you not to lead in the new normal? Are you seeing higher levels of attrition? Are you seeing a reactive style that's causing people to be overworked and underappreciated? Are you hearing lots of noise about people who are thinking about moving on or quiet quitting? Perhaps you have a lot of people on the team that are quiet quitters. So sort of understanding where you can link the need for leading in the new normal to an objective, again, going back to the negotiation strategy, to an objective that your executive leadership would have, and tying those two together and talking about how that will make a difference, presenting data like I shared about the productive difference and the retention differences when you have engaged and inspired employees is a great way to do it. And then to think about really what outcome you want, where they're coming from. So they might think, well, this is just not important. What's most important is the following. So really understanding their position and then framing your points. And this information is in the handout, in ways where you can have that conversation, prepared to speak to what's in it for them, and then looking for that common ground.
That's great. Great advice. We have Jay Kohler saying, any thoughts on how to manage up in a competitive work environment when surrounded by self-promoters? It's a good one.
Wow, yeah, that is a really good one. Yeah, so I guess the first question that I would have, is it Jay? The first question that I would have for Jay is, what does managing up for you mean? So the way that I came about it is managing up is arming your leadership or people above you with information they need to do their jobs, where you're influencing in areas where you're really competent. I don't really see managing up as being in relation to other people. So I'm curious to know how these other individuals that are competitive and you're working with are impacting your ability to manage up. So I don't know if Jay wants to come on and we can chat about it, that would be amazing. And if not, we can leave it there to just say I would look at managing up as an individual interaction where you're really trying to get something that you need to do your job. I often find that it's best not to focus so much on what others are doing around us in order for us to be most effective.
That's good advice as well. All right, this is a little bit of a longer question. So this is from Janelle. Hi, Kim, thank you so much for your excellent presentation. Wanted to ask, in the previous slides on for the leadership mandate, could you go back to show the points for the inspired, engaged, satisfied levels and share what are the particular KPIs and challenges with transitioning from one level to the other? So, you know, is there a way I think you can measure some of that? I think is what she's going for there. Or
yeah,
if Janelle wants to pop on for sure and let us know specifically.
that would be great if she wants to pop on. In the meantime, I will go back to that slide. Janelle, that I think you are interested in. Actually, let me take this.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you for the question and thank you for your presentation too. I was thinking that with these KPIs that you could share, just some easy wins with each one, that we would know where we're at with certain employees and not others, and just also too with you know, transitioning from one level to the other. Once you have X, then it's easier to go to the next level, but then, you know, maybe it's a harder effort to go from the middle level to the top level. It's the slide prior that you shared before, and that it was related to the Maslow's hierarchy of needs too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this one.
Mhm.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't know that it's in reading the study that this is something that you're like at one level and you progress to the next. I got the sense that you're looking for an upward progression, and the way that you measure this stuff, in my experience in, you know, the world of social science, is you ask the employees. So you would ask them, and then you would actually look at their performance. So if you asked an employee, like, how are you, do you feel connected to the mission of the organization, which might be a question you would ask to gauge if they're an inspired employee. And then you would go back and look at their performance evaluation and see, are they significantly outperforming some of their counterparts who are saying that they're not feeling connected to the mission. That's how I might go about doing it. So I think in this realm of soft leadership, you know, soft leadership skills, and I hate that word because these are actually leadership skills. There's nothing soft about them. It's how we know them though. So if we think about how we measure those, a lot of this is through engagement surveys. I know many companies are doing those already, tracking them over time, really talking to people and informing that connection with your people as well. So if you're talking to them regularly, you should have a good sense of how they're feeling about the job that they're doing and the purpose of work in their lives.
That's a great answer. Thank you. It's so actionable because now I have so many ideas that came to mind as you shared that. So it's perfect. Thank you.
Wonderful. I'm so happy to hear it. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, Kim, I had a thought too. A lot of us have done the Myers-Briggs analysis and some of those types of, you know, tests about, and they tell you more about your personality and things. How do you think those help with this type of, you know, new management style?
I think certainly what's really important, there's two things that I think are important about Myers-Briggs. The first is understanding who you are. So let's say, like, so often leadership is associated with extroversion, but we know through Susan Cain, who wrote Quiet, and others, that there are real strengths in leadership that introverts bring to the table. So that's one important thing, is understanding your own strengths and how you can really channel those and use those for effective leadership. But when I've been in companies and we've used Myers-Briggs, where I found it really helpful was understanding differences between different people and their styles and how you might want to communicate with them. And I think it helps with empathy. One workshop that I went to for Myers-Briggs had the N's, which is the intuitive types who think more theoretical and big picture in one group, and they had the S's who are more detailed and sensing oriented. They experience the world more through day-to-day and kind of present moment things. They divided us into those two groups, and they asked the question of what is time? And the N group came back with, well, it's planetary motion, and it's how we, it was very conceptual about how we measure progress and how things evolve. Whereas the S group came back with it's minutes, it's seconds, it's hours, it's days. And so I think when you start to appreciate how people perceive the world very differently, these tools can really help surface that, but then it can help us create empathy so that when we're working with somebody and we're like, why are they not seeing what I'm seeing? We can start to understand, well, I have to do a little bit more work to create a connection with how that employee might see or that resource might see the world.
That's great. I think that's all of the questions from the chat. So I would love to invite anyone else that might have a question to pop on and ask away to Kim.
So it looks like we have from, is it
Vishaki. Hi, Vishaki
Nice.
from Aerospace. So thank you, Kim. Lovely presentation. A lot of reinforcement of what we are learning as new leaders in this day and age. I agree with you. It seemed different before. It seems a very different ballgame now. My question to you is more so towards when do you draw a line towards here I am a manager trying to grow my employee versus I need to draw a line at insubordination. And like this is not done. This is still, regardless of the changing days and times, this is still not done.
Yes, excellent question, and one that is really important. And this is, again, I think coming back to setting up that foundation where your employee is absolutely clear about what it is that's expected of her or him. So for example, and this is where I actually, so a lot of coaching, I recommend to my clients a lot of coaching in these conversations where oftentimes managers will give feedback regarding here's what you should be doing and here's what you need to do differently. And what I found can work really well is if you sit down with an employee and say, here's what the goal is, and you're not accomplishing it. What's going on? What do you need? How are you going to accomplish that goal? So you actually have the employee come up with options for progressing along the lines of taking ownership of what they're doing. You're not just consulting and driving information down from them, but you're getting them engaged in the process of saying, well, here's what I can do. I can resolve it this way. And then if they're still not performing, then you have all of the information, the conversation that you need to say, you know what, you had committed to this. It didn't result in what we were looking for. And now we need to progress this conversation to the next level. So it's really about having conversations where you're inviting the employee into being part of the resolution, and then also being very direct about expectations and giving them feedback in a way that encourages, again, that growth and that investment in continuous improvement.
Thank you.
Good question. Yeah. Appreciate it.
I think Rafia, you have a question? You want to pop on?
Hi there. First of all, Kim, thank you so much for such a great presentation and keeping us captured, and also sharing your story and very personal, I guess, strategy of leadership. So I did have a question that's a little different from some of the pointers that you shared. It's more on your personal side. So I guess you said in hindsight, you realized that, the strategy that you took, the way you interacted with the upper management and leadership team, you would have done it differently. Maybe that's something related to culture and the changes and all the Gen Zs. I'm not sure. But my point is, what made you realize that, you could have done it differently? Like just maybe highlight of that?
I think I started seeing it even before I left corporate. So it was really when I found myself in IT as a senior leader. I didn't grow up in IT. I didn't come up through the ranks. I came in as a business person who was very skilled at leadership change and running operations as a business, which is what they needed in the units that I ran. So I was a transformational IT leader. And so, I started to really see the difference in the levels of bias that women and people of color had in IT relative to the business side, where representation is much more evenly split between men and women. And so when I started to see that additional bias, it really became clear to me that the problem was not that we women should be adapting to the norms of leadership, but that we needed to figure out ways to bring the skills that we are really good at to start to change some of these norms by us getting visibility and leverage and positions of power in the IT space. And so then I became very passionate about women bringing their skills to the workplace and them being authentically who they are, and to really breaking the mold of the traditional leadership model and bringing in new ways of leading that, as I mentioned, I'm very passionate about studying leadership. So as I was learning about leadership, how to, really think about ways to bring, more of that authenticity and inclusion into the environments that I was leading.
Great, thank you. Thanks for sharing.
And Teresa, I do have something I have to jump off for in 2 minutes. So I'm wondering if maybe, I know I don't know how that happened, but I'm wondering if maybe if anybody else has any questions, we can just get them in written form and take a look and respond to them.
That would be so awesome. We want to thank you so much, Kim, for taking the time to be with us today. I thought this was a really rich presentation with a lot of information for the group. And we did have someone ask if they could have the slides, and I said, yeah, I'm pretty sure you would let us have the slides, and we would get that out to everyone along with the links so that people can do some of the worksheets that you recommended. So thank you again very much. It is time to close. So I think we have a closing slide. Just to remind everyone about our upcoming events. We can go to the next slide, please. The Southern California CIO Executive Summit is on December 14th, sponsored by Avanta, which is one of our partners. So if you haven't already signed up for that, please do. And I think that the last piece is membership. Just a reminder too, that we are a membership-based organization. For those of you that are not members and would like to learn more about that, here is an email address that you can respond to, or if you can even just let me know, and I'm happy to connect you with our membership committee. I think the final slide is all of our member companies, just in case you're interested. So these are the folks that we are interacting with on a regular basis. And Lionsgate's a long-term member of Innovate at UCLA, and I really encourage you guys to think about that for your own companies. Again, thank you, Kim, and thank you, everybody else.
Thank you all. It was such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right, and there's more to come from Innovate at UCLA WIT in 2023. So we will get that information out to everybody as soon as we get our schedule going for next year. Thanks a lot.